Okay, welcome to French history. So, as usual, before you start, make sure your phone's on silent or in a drawer. Make sure that you've got sound for the podcast. You might want to use your textbook to refer to. You might want highlighter pens, and the worksheet can be printed off or done electronically, and you might want a cup of tea. Okay, so we've been looking in recent lessons at the reactions to the constitutional monarchy and how constitutional monarchy had become increasingly, I suppose we could say, under threat between 1791 and 92. Okay, so we've been looking at how what's influenced that in terms of the religious settlement to do with the civil constitution of the clergy. We've looked at the king's decision to flee, we've looked at the rise of the political clubs, and we've looked at why they decided to go to war in April 1792. So we want to consolidate all that today and start to think about how did all of those things come together to ultimately cause the breakdown of constitutional monarchy that we'll see in the summer of 1792. So today we're going to describe what it was like in the early stages of the war and how well the French fared. We're going to review the chronology of the period that we've been learning and think about what were the key turning points that were the sort of nails in the coffin of constitutional monarchy, if you like. And then we're going to evaluate and analyse the role of these different factors and think about this question about whether we think that the constitutional monarchy was a viable form of government and whether its failure was inevitable. So, first task is, can you go to the team's assignment called Reactions to Change Internally and Externally quiz? And there's a 20 question, I think, recap quiz on what we did last week, which you can complete. Should take you about 5 minutes in order to remind yourself on the things that have been happening in 1791-92 in France. So pause the video now if you've not done this quiz already and do the recap quiz, and then come back to this to restart the lesson once you have done that. Okay, so for those of us that have done the quiz and for those of us that have just finished it, we're now going to move on to today's lessons. So our first task that we're going to look at is, okay, we know that in April 1792 war broke out when the French actually declared war on Austria, so it was Austria that they were fighting initially. This was an Austrian-Prussian alliance, which was very worrying because they had been natural enemies for much of the 17th century. This process of German dualism, they had now come together in opposition to France. However, initially it's mainly Austria that the French are fighting. So only 7 deputies had refused to vote in favour of the war. It had been almost a unanimous kindly agreed upon as a good course of action. But what I want you to do is just pause the worksheet in a minute and read through the information. So pause the video in a minute, read through the first part of the worksheet and just summarise the information. What were the main reasons for the French doing poorly in the war? Okay, so on the right hand side there's a box for you to just note down what are the key things going on that are happening in the early stages of the war, and ultimately, was the war a good thing or a bad thing for France? Okay, there's a little stretching challenge suggested here. You can create an acronym to help you remember the key problems that the French experienced in the war. That might just make it a bit more memorable, these key facts. So pause the video now, go and have a go at task 1, and then come back to check your answers. Okay, so it's a pretty straightforward task this, so I won't spend too long, but the key thing is that the divisions between the old royal army, the whites, so the white was the colour of the Bourbon monarchy and the Capetian monarchy, and the blues, the blue and red, remember the colours of the tricolour, that was associated with Paris and the National Guard. So there was a division amongst these kind of the old army and these new recruits. They didn't have much kind of solidarity between them. And the French army was pretty large, we're talking about 150,000 were fighting the Austrians in the early campaigns, but this number belied perhaps a weakness in terms of skill, training, experience, discipline. And let's not forget that 60% of the officers in the French army had already fled as émigrés abroad. So in terms of leadership, the army was looking in pretty poor shape. And there's also animosity not just to the army leaders in each regiment, but to the overall leader of the National Guard, Lafayette, because of his action in suggesting that they open fire on the protesters at the Champ de Mars massacre. So this, we're seeing in 1792 that Lafayette goes from being one of the great heroes of the revolution to being almost kind of like a betrayer of the revolution. And it's in some ways founded, as it suggests on the sheet. He was in some ways plotting to try and remove the influence of the more radical elements. He wanted to secure constitutional monarchy ultimately, and he felt that they were a threat to that. And this all came to a head at Lille, where when they were involved in a fight against the Austrians, they actually fled at the sight of the enemy and killed their commanding officer. And in the kind of context of this, Northern France was invaded, so not only are they at war, but they are now under threat of being completely invaded. And this heightens mistrust back at home because, as we said, they weren't united before they declared war, and so all these divisions are just becoming more festering, aren't they? They're becoming more real, more important now, because people like Marie Antoinette, who are actually passing plans to the French from the French to the Austrians, are increasingly seen as enemies, counter-revolutionaries, and that kind of influences the assembly to pass new legislation to deal with these enemies, such as the laws against refractory priests and émigrés' property. And then that in turn triggers Louis to use his suspensory veto, which he has the right to do, let's not forget, to protect those enemies by delaying this legislation. And he also dismisses this Brissatin government that he had kind of sort of created in the context of trying to broker some sort of peace with the more radical elements of the assembly because they were in favour of war. He dismisses them in the face of criticisms of his dispensary veto, and that obviously is viewed as treachery. And we also see the rise of the Fédérés, these radical volunteers named after the Fête de la Fédération, where a lot of them would have attended on the 14th of July to celebrate the storming of the Bastille every year. These are radical volunteers from the provinces. They're going to come up in next lesson when we talk about the rise of the sans-culottes. And they're brought into the National Guard, and they change its nature from one of protecting constitutional monarchy to being ultimately an enemy of constitutional monarchy, and are really sort of crucial for understanding what happens next in the summer of 1792. So overall, we could say, the war had pretty negative consequences, and it's difficult for us to really see, I think, now how they could have expected anything different, but they clearly did. So moving on to task 2, I thought what would be really useful for you to do is just to look back over how everything you've been learning fits into a chronology, because it's been quite thematic, hasn't it? So sometimes when we're looking at causes of events, it's quite important to look at when things happen and identify the turning points. Okay, so what I would like you to do is, first of all, can you click on the link? You should be able to click on the link and go to this podcast by Mr. Alsop History. Just watch the first 5 minutes. The rest of it is good, but it talks about things we haven't studied yet, which might be a bit confusing. It's the top link on that website. So it's 5 minutes listening to a podcast, and then what I'd like you to do is colour code your timeline of the events. Anything that's positive, good, is green, showing that constitutional monarchy is successful, it's being established, or that it's helping constitutional monarchy to exist. And then red, anything that's bad for constitutional monarchy, anything that shows that it's under threat. Okay, now I have included the events that we've yet to study, i.e. spoiler alert on how constitutional monarchy comes to an end, but I thought that was important, for obviously that's the kind of the end point of this whole narrative on why it fails, for that to be on the timeline. Okay, so pause the video now and complete those 2 activities, and then come back. Okay, so here's some suggested answers on that. So I've colour-coded the above. Some of these are debatable. So, for example, the in July 1790 we see the civil constitution of the clergy. You know, that is part of the new constitution, so you might have put that in, shows the constitutional monarchy is being established. And we did say when we talked about that there were some good reasons why you might want to you might want to alter the nature of the Catholic Church in France. However, I've put it as red because clearly we also said it had some big repercussions in terms of creating divisions. So the general pattern we can see is that it starts off quite optimistic, doesn't it? In 1790 we've got quite a lot of hopefulness, optimism, support for this new constitution, and even support for Louis as he is viewed to be accepting this new constitution. We do have a few negatives, so I've put down as a turning point here the civil constitution of the clergy because it created those divided loyalties. More on that in our next task. As a sort of that is going to be a kind of a persistent problem at the heart of the revolution from thence on. So there is things which do not bode well even in 1790. If we look at 1791, we see that actually things begin to turn sour quite quickly, and this is around the civil constitution of the clergy, and that influenced Louis partly to flee, but it's also around this kind of the radicalisation of politics, the death of Mirabeau, and in the background to this we've got the rise of the political clubs, haven't we? And another key turning point here I'd have picked up on is the flight to Varennes. It opened up the whole suggestion, didn't it, of republicanism, and it really kind of created two camps in terms of set positions on what to do with the monarchy and whether the monarchy should be a feature of this new constitution. Okay, and then we can see it's a little bit negative. There's some negative things going on in 1791, definitely, but actually we shouldn't dismiss the constitution at this point. And we said even things like, after the Champ de Mars massacre, the constitutional was persisted with, wasn't it? It was the moderates that were in the ascendancy following the Champ de Mars massacre. There was conservative support was rallying behind the king in fear of the radical elements in French society. So we've still got some green here. We've the Legislative Assembly begins to sit. They begin this new era of government under this new constitution does start. However, we've then got quite a lot of negative things going on in 1792, and that's, I would say, probably around this another turning point, which was the declaration of war on Austria, which we'll come on to a bit more in a minute. But the fact that they've added another complication to this already quite conflicted picture was another reason why constitutional monarchy came to a resounding end in September 1792. Okay, so we've had a look at the chronology, and I want us just to draw everything together now. How do each of these turning points ultimately dent the chances of constitutional monarchy remaining? Okay, so on the next task on the worksheet, you've got a grid. Could you try and put down 2 to 3 points in each box explaining how each development further worsened the chances of the new constitution's survival? You might also want to think about the links between each of them and maybe add some arrows on your sheet to show how these things kind of were interlinked with each other. So pause the video now and then complete task 3 on your worksheet. Okay, some suggested answers. So we could say that, as previously discussed, the civil constitution of the clergy forced people to choose between their faith and the revolution, and this is going to become increasingly important later on during one of the big causes of the outbreak of terror is the fact that the central government don't have control over the provinces of France. So it's those conservative provinces, places like the Vendée, that rebel against the central government that are going to be a key ingredient in explaining why the terror happens. And we can see that their opposition to this civil constitution of the clergy and the fact that 75% of priests in some of these areas refused to take the oath, and so you had the groundswell of opposition occurring right in the first year of the constitution being made. And these became enemies of the revolution, and Louis' support of these supposed enemies of the revolution was another thing that would alienate the more radical elements against him. Okay, so the political clubs, we could say that power was becoming more fragmented as democratic power was widened out with the creation of the assembly, which France hadn't had before. It opened up the possibility of different political views taking place. So the king's power, although he was still the executive, he was in something of a power struggle, not only against the assembly but also against this Paris Commune that, as we see in 1792 in the summer, which I haven't done yet, and in 1793 becomes really powerful because it's the support base of the it's where the sans-culottes operate from. Okay, and in terms of taking action into their own hands, that's where a lot of it comes from. So there's divisions in the assembly, there's a lot of infighting, and there's these 1,500 political clubs. That is a lot, and some of them are aimed at these passive citizens, people that wouldn't have been, were not included initially in the idea of what democracy would look like in the new constitution. So, we know that the radical incendiary press, people like Marat, Desmoulins and Hébert, are sort of riling up these working classes, these sans-culottes as they become increasingly known as. We can see that through things like at the Champ de Mars massacre. And it was the influence of the political clubs that encouraged Louis to flee, wasn't it, after the death of people like Mirabeau, who were sort of trying to bridge the divisions between the revolution and the monarchy. So we look at the flight to Varennes. I think this is quite a straightforward one. We could say, remember we looked at that source, that Louis made a declaration to the French people and said that he didn't basically support the new constitution at all, or therefore the revolution. And then he changed his mind when he was cross-examined, and that showed that he was not to be trusted. And public opinion changed dramatically about Louis as a result. We know that he was vilified in the press, and people began to speak openly about removing or even killing him. And this kind of deepened the political divisions, as now the question of whether the monarch should feature in the new constitution was debated in the assembly, with the Cordeliers and the Jacobins, the Cordeliers were in the assembly, but the Jacobins siding with the Cordeliers, who would put forward this petition to put the king on trial. So it really links in with those political divisions. And this led to the massacre of the demonstrators in favour of putting the king on trial at the Champ de Mars, and this in turn was what would destroy the kind of allegiance of the more radical revolutionaries to people like Lafayette, and see the division further increase. And the war, well, we could say that that there was also division because of the war, because the Jacobins didn't agree on it. The Brissatin faction, or the Girondin faction, were much in favour of it, whereas Robespierre and the Jacobins were not. And although, as we said at the start of today's lesson, it was supposed to unify them against the foreign enemy, actually it revealed how divided French society was, and they began to be people began to assign blame to traitors at home, counter-revolutionaries. Then this included Louis himself, who was openly supporting what people saw as enemies of the revolution, these refractory priests and émigrés, by trying to vetoing legislation aimed at these enemies. And we also said earlier in the lesson that it changed the nature of the National Guard, because these fédérés radicalised it, and they are instrumental in the events of the summer of 1792. And ultimately it provoked an acute crisis because France was now invaded. Okay, and it's this hysteria that leads to the direct action in getting rid of Louis once they are feared for their own lives in Paris, as we will see it soon. So in terms of links, they're all very much linked, aren't they? The civil constitution of the clergy and the rise of the political clubs encouraged Louis to flee. The political clubs and the political divisions also relevant to the war, isn't it? Because the war was a divisive issue between these groups. We could also say that the civil constitution of the clergy created the idea of there being these non-jure priests, which later on became the enemies of France during the war, and Louis' therefore attempt to protect them was seen as unpatriotic. So there's lots of links we can make amongst all of these things that we've been talking about. So final thought for today is, do you think that the Constitution of 1791 could have survived? And if, this is like what if history, what if something hadn't happened, like they hadn't created the civil constitution of the clergy, or they hadn't gone to war, if they hadn't, if Louis hadn't have tried to flee, could that constitution have carried on in France? Or do you think that there is an element of inevitability about the failure of the constitution? So just have a think about that and maybe write down your ideas on your worksheet, and we'll discuss it on Wednesday. There is a Jocelyn Hunt very short article on this issue that I've put in the assignment on Teams that you may want to have a look at to see what her take on it is. So we'll end the lesson there. Thank you very much for your attendance. Just check that you've done these things to have completed the lesson and then uploaded your work, and then we will meet this week to discuss the rise of the sans-culottes.